The sun hung low in the sky over Bitter Creek, casting long shadows over the dusty town square. Marlo Thorne stood at the center, her hands bound behind her back, the rope around her neck, as the crowd gathered in hushed silence. She could hear the murmurs of the townsfolk, the mix of curiosity and unease filling the air. The noose scratched against her pale skin, and tears streaked down her dirt-stained cheeks. She was just 23 years old, an orphan, a seamstress, and in moments she would be dead for a crime she didn't commit. Judge Harrison Blackwood's voice rang out across the square, cold and unfeeling. His words echoed in Marlo's ears as he read her death sentence. Marlo Thorne, you stand convicted of theft, of taking what does not belong to you. You stole my wife's emerald necklace, a piece worth more than most of you will ever see in your lives. For this crime you will hang. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the sound deafening. Competing with the harsh rhythm of the rope around her throat, she knew she was innocent. She had never taken a thing that wasn't hers. But who would believe the word of a poor, orphaned seamstress over that of the respected judge? And who would care enough to speak up? Marlo had worked late in Mrs. Blackwood's parlor, hemming a dress for the judge's wife when the necklace went missing. She was the only one there, and the only one to be blamed. But what no one knew, what no one could ever know, was that it wasn't Marlo who had taken the necklace. It was Mrs. Blackwood herself. Marlo had seen it all. Through the window she watched as the judge's wife buried the necklace in the garden behind their house, hiding it with her own hands, knowing full well that she was framing Marlo for a crime she hadn't committed. But who would listen to the word of a poor, orphan girl? No one, not when the judge's word was law in Bitter Creek. The crowd was small, maybe 40 souls. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared with morbid curiosity, the excitement of a public hanging stirring something dark inside them. Children pressed their faces against the windows of the nearby storefronts, their wide eyes taking in the spectacle. This was Bitter Creek's first public hanging in 3 years. Judge Blackwood had made sure that it would be a grand event, something to be remembered, something to remind the people of his authority. Marlo's knees buckled slightly as she stood on the wooden platform, her heart racing as the executioner, a thin man named Garrett Walsh, tested the trapdoor beneath her feet. The wood creaked ominously, and for a brief moment all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. She wanted to pray, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. How could God allow this to happen? She had never done anything wrong. She had worked tirelessly, day and night, mending clothes, sewing dresses, and earning just enough to pay for a small room above the general store. She had never taken what wasn't hers. She had never stolen. Yet here she was, on the verge of death for a crime she didn't commit. Her hands shook as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the rope tightening around her neck, the weight of it pressing against her skin. She thought of the people who had treated her kindly, the few she had known in her short life. Would they mourn her? Would they care? Or would they simply forget her, as most had forgotten the poor, orphaned seamstress? She longed for the warmth of her mother's embrace, but that was a comfort she would never feel again. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving Marlo to fend for herself in a world that had little room for someone like her. Judge Blackwood's voice cut through her thoughts. "The sentence has been passed," he declared, his cold eyes meeting hers for just a moment. There was something in his gaze, something unsettling, something dark that made her stomach churn. Satisfaction. He was enjoying this. The power, the control, the finality of it all. Marlo knew he was a cruel man, but she had never realized just how much pleasure he took in the suffering of others. The judge snapped his pocket watch shut, his eyes never leaving her as he nodded to the executioner. Garrett's hand moved toward the lever that would release the trapdoor, and Marlo felt a surge of panic. She was running out of time. In just moments, she would be gone, her life extinguished without anyone ever knowing the truth. But just as the trapdoor was about to fall, they heard the sound of spurs clanking against the wooden steps. The slow, deliberate rhythm of boots hitting the ground. It was the unmistakable sound of someone approaching the platform. But the footsteps were unsteady, slurring, almost drunken. The crowd shifted, whispering among themselves, but no one moved. All eyes turned to the stairs where a man appeared at the top, his boots making a rhythmic, unsteady sound with each step. He was a cowboy, his weathered face telling the story of a man who had spent far too many years on the trail. His black hat sat crooked on his head, and his brown duster was covered in dust and stains, some of which looked questionable. He looked like a drifter, someone who had wandered into the wrong town at the wrong time. But as he made his way toward the platform, it became clear that this was no ordinary man. This was Caleb Iron Creek Mackenzie. The drunk cowboy's eyes were bloodshot, but they held a sharpness that cut through the haze of alcohol. He took in everything, the positioning of the men around the square, the way Judge Blackwood's hand rested on his gun, the fear in Marlowe's eyes, and most importantly, the way the crowd was watching. There was a tension in the air, something that wasn't right. And Caleb had seen enough hangings to know when something was off. Judge Blackwood, clearly irritated by the interruption, turned toward the cowboy. "This is a legal proceeding," he barked. "Move along, cowboy, before I have you arrested for disturbing the peace." Caleb swayed slightly, but he didn't back down. His voice came out slurred, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Legal? You call this legal?" He gestured toward Marlowe, nearly losing his balance in the process. "You're about to hang a girl who looks like she ain't never hurt a fly. What exactly did she do? Murder the whole town?" The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Some were uncomfortable with Caleb's boldness. Others were beginning to wonder the same thing he was asking. Was this really legal? Was Marlowe really guilty, or was something far more sinister at play? Judge Blackwood's face flushed red with anger. "She's a thief," he said. "She stole valuable property from my wife." "The law is clear on this matter." Caleb let out a bitter laugh, his words carrying across the square. "Your wife? Well, ain't that convenient? Judge, jury, and victim all in the same household." The crowd's unease grew. This wasn't just a drunk cowboy. This was someone challenging the most powerful man in Bitter Creek, and for the first time in Marlowe's life, someone was speaking up for her. For the first time, someone was questioning the authority of Judge Blackwood. The tension in the square was thick, palpable. The crowd had fallen silent, waiting for something to happen. Caleb stood there, swaying slightly, his eyes never leaving Judge Blackwood's. For the first time in a long while, the judge's confidence wavered. He was used to controlling situations with his sheer authority, but this time things were different. The cowboy, though drunk, had thrown him off balance. There was no mistaking it. The people were listening, and for the first time, they weren't all in agreement with the judge's version of events. Marlowe, still standing on the platform, could barely breathe as the tension mounted. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, their voices hushed but full of doubt. It was as though a veil had been lifted from the town, and the cracks in the judge's control were becoming too obvious to ignore. And then Caleb spoke again, his voice cutting through the silence. "Judge," Caleb said, his words slurred but carrying an unmistakable weight. "You're about to hang an innocent woman, and for what? A necklace that's gone missing? You say you found it on her, but where is the evidence? Where is the proof?" Judge Blackwood's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected to be questioned like this. He was used to his word being law in Bitter Creek, and for the most part it always had been. But now, faced with the possibility that the truth might be uncovered, he felt the pressure mounting. Caleb took a step forward, his boots scraping against the wooden platform. "You've been too confident, Judge," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "But not once have you mentioned where the necklace is. Not once have you explained how you've got this girl convicted without any real evidence." His voice grew louder, his anger seeping through the slurred words. "You've been so quick to hang her, but you haven't even looked at the truth. You're so focused on your own power that you've forgotten about justice." The crowd shifted again. People exchanged glances, unsure of what was unfolding before them. They had trusted Blackwood, after all. He had been the judge for years, and no one had ever questioned him. But now, something was happening, something that was making them see the cracks in the system they had always believed in. Caleb wasn't backing down. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something that made everyone in the crowd gasp. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a badge. A tarnished, dented badge, but unmistakably real. The words Deputy U.S. Marshal were etched on it. Caleb didn't even look at it as he held it out in front of him for all to see. The crowd went silent. The judge's face, once flushed with anger, drained of color as he saw the badge. The authority he had wielded for so long was suddenly in question. He had assumed he was untouchable, that no one would dare challenge him. But this man, this drunk cowboy, wasn't just a simple stranger. He was a federal officer, and his words had weight. Caleb turned to face the crowd, holding up the badge for all to see. "This is a federal issue now," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You're all witnesses to what's been happening here. This girl," he gestured to Marlowe, still standing in her position on the platform, "she hasn't been tried fairly. There's no evidence against her. And this judge," Caleb's eyes locked onto Blackwood's, "he's hiding something. You all know it." The crowd shifted again, more voices now rising in disagreement. They had all believed Blackwood's version of events, but now they were questioning it. How could they not? The federal marshal had just dropped a bombshell, and the judge had no way of answering for it. He was a man backed into a corner, his power crumbling with every word Caleb spoke. Judge Blackwood, however, wasn't ready to give up so easily. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. "This is my town," he spat. "My court. You have no jurisdiction here." His voice was trembling now, desperation seeping into his words. "You're just a drunk cowboy, and I won't be threatened by you." Caleb didn't flinch. His eyes never left the judge's, and his hand never moved from the badge. "I'm not threatening you, Blackwood. I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing." His words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like time itself had stopped. The whole town was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. But then Caleb reached into his saddlebag, pulling out something that caused even the judge's blood to run cold. It was the necklace, the very same necklace that Marlowe had been accused of stealing. The crowd gasped as Caleb held it high above his head for everyone to see. It glimmered in the afternoon sun, its emerald stones catching the light in a way that made it seem almost like it was alive. "This," Caleb said, his voice full of finality, "is the necklace you said she stole, the one you've accused her of taking. I found it buried in your garden, Blackwood. The very place you told everyone was off limits. Tell me, Judge, how does it end up there if it was Marlowe's?" The crowd erupted into murmurs, their disbelief turning into anger. Caleb had just turned the entire town's understanding of the case upside down. Blackwood's face went pale as the realization dawned on him. He had been caught. The necklace was in his own backyard, and it wasn't Marlowe who had stolen it, it was his own wife. Caleb let the silence linger for a moment, letting the weight of the truth settle over everyone. "I know what you've been doing, Blackwood," he said quietly, his voice a low growl. "You've been covering for your wife's theft, framing this innocent girl, and using your power to get away with it." "But not anymore," Judge Blackwood tried to recover, his voice shaking with rage. "You're lying. You planted that necklace." But the damage had already been done. People began to speak up, their voices full of accusation. "I saw her that night," Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, called out. "She came to my house, crying. She told me she'd seen something strange, but she was too scared to speak about it. She told me she'd seen something in the judge's garden." The murmurs turned into a chorus of voices. People were finally speaking out. Samuel Mueller, the store owner, stepped forward. "I remember. She came to me too, said she had seen something that could get her in trouble." But no one listened. Blackwood's grip on his gun tightened, but even he knew he was losing control. His once unshakable authority had vanished, replaced by fear and desperation. He had no more answers. No more excuses. Caleb looked at Marlowe, who stood in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time since the trial began, she felt a glimmer of hope. Could it be possible? Could she really be free? Before the judge could react, Caleb stepped forward, cutting the ropes around Marlowe's wrists. The noose that had been around her neck for what felt like an eternity fell to the ground with a heavy thud. She collapsed into his arms, her body shaking with the release of all the tension she had held onto for so long. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Caleb nodded, helping her to her feet. As the crowd began to disperse, Sheriff Wade Morrison finally spoke. He had stood silently through most of the confrontation, but now he stepped forward, his voice gruff but steady. "Judge, you're under arrest for embezzlement, corruption, and the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent woman. Judge Blackwood's face turned ashen. His world was crumbling around him, and he knew there was no escaping it. Marlowe was free, and Caleb had exposed the truth. For the first time, Bitter Creek would have to face the consequences of the corruption that had been allowed to fester for so long. Marlowe, still reeling from the turn of events, looked around at the people who had watched her trial, her execution so close. They were all staring at her now, some with guilt, others with relief. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a symbol of what happens when truth finally comes to light. Caleb looked at her one last time before he turned to leave. "You're free now," he said simply. "But the town still has a lot to sort through."